Okay, I want to welcome everyone who's here in the audience and those of you who are with us online. Thanks for taking the time. I'm Steve Higgins, the director of the Vermont Center on Behavior and Health, and welcome to today's lecture in our monthly lecture series. We're in for a good one. Our guest is Dr. Michael Amlung, and he's going to speak to us, as you may be able to see on the slides, on the application of behavioral economics to investigate contextual influences on alcohol and cannabis use. So it's something very, very much in the interest of those of us in the Vermont Center on Behavior and Health. So Michael is an associate professor in the Department of Applied Behavioral Science at the University of Kansas, where he is the director of graduate studies. And I have to put in a plug for KU. I have deep affection there for KU, having gotten my PhD there at 4 wonderful years in Lawrence, Kansas. Mike did his undergraduate training in the Indiana University and his graduate work at University of Georgia, where he did a lot of work on alcohol and was working with his mentor, James McKillop. And he did a postdoc at the University of Missouri, also working on alcohol. And it was a T32 that was supported by NIAAA. Michael is highly productive with more than 100 peer-reviewed publications already to his credit and numerous NIH grants, including an R01 from NIAAA. He's conducted numerous excellent studies on behavioral economics and how it influences the kinds of things we're going to hear from him today. Many of them with James McKillop, his former mentor, and Jim Murphy, who I think has connections already through others here. I have great respect for him. I was mentioning to Michael that I remember when McKillop and Murphy were just postdocs, so how quickly time flies. So now we have one of their students who's an associate professor joining us. And so he does great work. They continue to do great work. They often do it collaboratively. So I'm very anxious to hear what he has to say today. So Michael, thanks for joining us. And please, the floor is all yours.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's a really great pleasure for me to be here. I've been following the center from afar for quite a while. I get the emails every month about joining your seminar series, and I'm just really excited to be here to tell you a little bit about the behavioral economics work that we're doing in my lab. But I want to start with, Steve kind of stole my thunder a little bit here, but there is an interesting pipeline between the University of Kansas and here at Vermont. So I'm part of an addiction research and treatment center at the University of Kansas, and Steve was our inaugural distinguished lecturer back in, I believe this was around 2019, I believe is when you came. So this is our press release at the University of Kansas for that. And then I also was aware that Steve received his PhD from the University of Kansas. So I tried to find an actual PDF copy of it on the library, the actual signature page. This was the best I could do. This is from ProQuest. This is Stephen Higgins in 1983 receiving his PhD dissertation from the University of Kansas on the transmission of superstitious operant behavior. So there's been a nice pipeline between KU and Vermont. Several of our graduates from my department have come here to be postdocs. Some of our current faculty trained here as graduate students. So even though we're geographically kind of distant from each other, there's a lot of intellectual and sort of training roots between the two. As I mentioned, I'm coming to you today from the Coffin-Logan Center for Addiction Research and Treatment at the University of Kansas. We are a hub on campus for training, education, research, and outreach related to addiction and addictive disorders. And a lot of our research focuses on improving health, understanding motivation and decision-making, but then also trying to reduce stigma So Steve, I don't remember if you were when you were at Kansas, if you were in the Dole building or not, or if you were in a different building. But I thought I might put that up there in case you recognize that building where we're located now. And as Steve also mentioned, I'm somebody who really values trainees and my role as director of graduate studies. But a lot of the work that I'm going to be presenting today is work that I've been able to support through mentees of mine. So in my current lab at the University of Kansas, here's just some of the wonderful people I have a chance to work with. Maybe this is generation 4 or generation 3 of behavioral economics researchers and clinicians and scientists. So several of the names you're going to see up here are you'll see their pictures come up throughout the talk today. And then also my former position before I went to KU was at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, where some of my students there have also done a lot of this work. So I really want to give them credit where credit is due. I think a lot of the ideas that are presented today originated from the students and postdocs I've been very fortunate to work with. So in terms of where we're going to go today, I think speaking to this audience, I don't need to spend a lot of time to convince you that behavioral economic approaches are very valuable to studying addiction and other forms of mental health disorders and psychiatric diagnoses. But for the sake of sort of giving everybody a common ground, and also if people are joining online that may not have as much of a foundation in this, a little bit about behavioral economic approaches. And then I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about the idea of context and the fact that substance use and other behaviors, they happen in a context. They happen in a particular environment. And I'm going to define sort of what I mean by context as we go forward. And then I'm going to share 3 lines of research from my lab that we've been doing over the past 5 or 10 years or so, looking at laboratory studies as well as online crowdsourcing studies of a particular behavioral economic process known as substance demand, which again, to many of you in the audience, is not going to be a new concept. But I'm going to talk to you about the importance of substance-related environmental cues, as well as what is the impact of having upcoming important activities or roles or responsibilities. And then a line of research also looking at impaired driving from a behavioral economic perspective. And then at the end, sort of talk about some of the current things that we're doing in my lab and where some of my trainees are pushing us in new, exciting future directions. All of that's going to be very much just sort of preview of what's on the horizon for us. So behavioral economics essentially is the integration of principles from economics, psychology, and operant learning theory to understand how people make choices. So people have a certain amount of resources that they can allocate to certain behaviors, and they have to make choices about how they allocate those resources. And those choices are influenced by a variety of factors, such as the price or the cost of behavior or engaging in that. And we define price broadly. It doesn't always mean monetary cost. It could be effort, it could be time, whatever it may be. A lot of my work and the work of others has also looked at delay to reward. So we know that often certain reinforcers that we want to come in contact with, we have to wait for those. And so how do those processes interact with our sort of desire to seek immediate gratification or immediate reinforcement? And then we're also starting to look more and more at the idea that these choices are not happening in isolation. There's often alternatives that are available to somebody. And so how does the availability and the relative value of alternative reinforcers play into this as well? And those of you who are familiar with this field know that a lot of this has coalesced around a particular model of addiction known as the reinforcer pathology model of addiction. So our late colleague and a giant in this field, and I know a very close colleague of Steve's, Warren Bickel, who I've had the pleasure to interact with many times in my career, sort of pioneered this idea of a reinforcer pathology model. And over the course of the development of it, we're on like reinforcer pathology 2.0, 3.0, et cetera. And then the next generation, Sam Acuff and others have added contextual elements to it. So it's this idea that there is this underlying pathology of reinforcement in that there's an overvaluation of addictive substances and increased preference for immediate gratification in individuals that are using substances or have a substance use disorder. And so in the context of behavioral economics and the reinforcer pathology model, we're often concerned with sort of 3 fundamental domains: substance demand, delay discounting, and what's known as proportionate substance-related reinforcement. And I don't have all the time in the world, so I'm going to focus predominantly today on substance demand. So just to put a definition on that, It's essentially a behavioral economics index of relative reinforcing value. So what we're going to do is we're going to look for a quantitative relationship between the consumption of a commodity and its cost. And most behavioral economics study, the cost is essentially the price to obtain that reinforcer or that commodity. And we have very efficient ways of doing this in our research, and often we use what are called hypothetical purchase tasks. So I know many people here at Vermont are using purchase tasks for different commodities, but we have alcohol purchase tasks, cigarette purchase tasks, cannabis, marijuana purchase tasks, et cetera. And just to orient everyone, the fundamental principle is how many drinks would you consume if they were a certain price? Murphy and McKillop established this method for the alcohol purchase task in 2006. And then you systematically increase the cost, right? So originally it went all the way up to over $1,000 per drink. We've sort of constrained that down to more realistic prices. But fundamentally, you're asking people, how many drinks would you consume, or how many cigarettes would you consume, or how many hits of a joint, or how many grams of cannabis would you consume at different prices? And we typically will measure that in kind of a standard or your typical drinking situation. But we also, in my research, have started using what I call state-based purchase tasks. So instead of in a typical evening or a typical week, it's right now, in this present moment, how many drinks would you consume based on how you're feeling and the experiences you're having in this moment? So that allows us to take an approach where we look at demand as something that fluctuates dynamically based on internal and external factors, right? And we're going to talk about a few of those today. Is that to say that the trait level is not important? Certainly it's not saying that. The trait level is very important. But I'm also interested in sort of what fluctuates in the moment when somebody's making a choice whether or not to drink alcohol or use a substance right now. And so we've figured out ways to sort of reshape the purchase task to be focused on the present moment. And the reason this is valuable is because we can plot your consumption on the X or on the Y-axis here as a function of price along the X-axis. So we often will plot these in log coordinates for proportionality, but today I'm just going to plot the X-axis in log coordinates. And so we end up getting what's called a demand curve, where consumption usually starts at a high amount, it's relatively stable for a while or inelastic. Then it reaches a certain point around mid-level price where it starts to decelerate and decrease as price increases. And then usually at some point, it reaches zero consumption or very minimal consumption. And you can see that it can differ based on individual to individual or group to group, where the blue curve is showing higher demand relative to the gray curve in this situation. And what's valuable about demand curves is then we can use different methods, whether it's demand curve modeling or observed demand indices, to actually generate some quantitative metrics from this. So you can look at what's called intensity, or Q0, which essentially is consumption at free price or very low price, or unrestricted consumption. You can look on the other end of the curve, which is the break point, which is the point at which they suppress their consumption. Think about this as like, it's just too expensive, I'm not going to consume anymore. So that's sort of the opposites of the demand curve. You can also look at the relative change in the slope of the demand curve over changes in price, also known as elasticity or the alpha parameter. That's one we'll often look at. And then if you take the consumption and multiply it times the price, you get a slightly different curve, which looks like these. These are called expenditure curves. And the advantage to these is we can look at some parameters here as well. So one's called Omax, sort of output maxed. This is the maximum that somebody's willing to expend on the substance in this configuration. So think about it as kind of like the maximum total output that somebody's willing to give for that substance. On the first figure, we had raw number of drinks or the breakpoint price. This is just a slightly different way of thinking about it. So if we look at alcohol demand specifically, there's been now a really robust and rich literature on this, showing that alcohol demand sort of reliably differentiates different subgroups of drinkers as well as clinical and non-clinical. So in the original Murphy and McKillop paper here, you can see the unfilled data points and the filled data points essentially are heavy drinkers and social drinkers. So in the heavy drinkers, we have higher demand across virtually every price as well as higher expenditure. Down here in McKillop 2010, This is severity of alcohol use disorder. So the upper 25% versus the lower 25%. And you can see that the upper 25% is kind of stacked on top of the lower 25%. And in this study over here by Berthollet, the individual data points are a little bit hard to see with the error bars, but essentially they're looking at severity of alcohol use disorder as no, mild, moderate, severe, and the curves stack on top of each other in sort of an orderly fashion. So it appears to be at the trait level an indicator of quantity of alcohol consumption as well as alcohol-related problems. In my lab, so this is Harry Patel, one of my former graduate students, showed that individuals that engage in alcohol-impaired driving also show elevated demand for alcohol relative to people who do not. So again, using demand as a way to, as a proxy for another high-risk behavior. Vanessa Morris from my lab is now a faculty member at a university in Canada, showed a similar process for people that were co-users of alcohol and cannabis. And then I did a study on alcohol and tobacco co-use. Again, the co-use group stacks on top of the single commodity use group. So it appears to differentiate people at the trait level in meaningful ways that can be informative for clinical purposes. But where I've become increasingly interested is not so much at the trait level, but at what happens in the actual real-time decisions in the natural environment or in laboratory situations where we're going to manipulate the context. And trained as a behavior scientist, I have to always remind myself that behavior happens in context. Like, we don't operate in a vacuum, right? Even though on these purchase tasks, we often create hypothetical scenarios with certain constraints, we have to acknowledge the fact that in the real world, people don't operate in these really sort of carefully contrived scenarios that we've created. So we have to understand the proximal antecedents of choice if we're going to really understand how people make behavioral decisions and choices. So I think about this as sort of the W questions, like where are you, when are you, why are you behaving some way, who are you, what are you doing right now, and then the how is also that other one. So there's been a series of studies, and there's systematic reviews and meta-analyses on these if you want to read more, but looking at a variety of contextual variables. So your current environment, I'm going to tell you about a study or two on that. Whether you're in a social situation or whether you're alone, whether you have certain external contingencies or upcoming roles or responsibilities. You're going to hear quite a bit about that today. Your mood or your affective state, whether or not you're currently intoxicated or not. Do you have alternative sources of reinforcement, the presence of the availability of alternative activities? All of that contributes to the context, right? So you have the ability to choose whether to use substances or not in that environment or in that situation. But where you're at with some of these things that are listed here also is going to have an impact on whether or not you're more or less likely to choose whether to use substances. So a couple of studies just to illustrate this point. So Sam Acuff did a really clever experiment on crowdsourcing where they essentially did alcohol purchase tasks where they told participants you're on your own or you're with I believe it was your friend group. And they showed that when people were with their friend group, they said they would drink more than if they were drinking alone. But even if they're drinking alone, they still drank about 4 drinks, right? So it's not that they don't drink at all when they're alone. It's just that it's enhanced when they're in a social situation. Max Owens did a study, and we replicated these findings in my dissertation study, where if you put people through a laboratory stress induction, for example, and do a sort of psychosocial stress paradigm in the lab, they report that they want to drink more when they're in that stressed state than when they're in a neutral, sort of more relaxation type of a manipulation. Again, it's important to understand, because one of the things that we hear about with drinking is that often it is sometimes viewed as a way to cope with negative affect and stress. This is an experimental way to probe that. When I was a postdoc, we did a study where we looked at the acute effects of alcohol on alcohol demand. And so in the lighter gray curve, it may be kind of hard to see, but this is the BAC. So we're looking at the ascending and the descending limb of the BAC. And the effects weren't very pronounced, but we did see from post-consumption to the ascending limb, it was a significant increase in alcohol demand. So people said they wanted to drink more when their BAC was rising, but that rapidly then decreased. And what's interesting is, while by the time they reached their peak, their level of demand had already gone down. right? And it was on its way down as the BAC came down as well. And so again, this is more of a behavioral pharmacology study that I did in Dennis McCarthy's lab to show that demand fluctuates in interesting ways sort of in the moment, right? It could be that people have heightened demand in general, but if you put them in a situation where they're intoxicated, it goes up even more so, right? And so this was all within subjects, multiple sessions here where, and it was counterbalanced. So this is, there's not really a between subjects effect here. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about 3 studies from my lab in particular. One is focusing on alcohol cue effects on demand for alcohol. The next one is a series of studies that my grad students have been working on, looking at next day responsibilities, and I'll define what those are in a moment, on cannabis demand and alcohol demand. And then a line of research that I started when I was a postdoc, and I've sort of been doing it sort of under the radar, behind the scenes research on alcohol and cannabis impaired driving, that I'll tell you a bit about as well. So to get us started, let's talk about alcohol cue effects on demand for alcohol. And I want you to take a moment, and I want you to think about the types of rooms, if you're a researcher or if you're a clinician, the types of spaces that you might collect your data in. Right, so here at Vermont, or where I'm at the University of Kansas, it probably looks something similar to this, possibly, right? Some sort of stark, very nondescript assessment room, right? There might be some artwork on the walls or bookcases or tables or whatever it may be, but it's a fairly neutral assessment room, or it's a conference room of some kind, right? And that can be a very valuable space to collect data. But if I'm interested in how the environment shapes drinking behavior, this is not the ideal space to be studying those things, right? So instead, wouldn't it be great if I could do research in a space that looks like this? So at the University of Kansas, we're fortunate to have a simulated bar lab. Many centers around the country have similar types of settings, but we've taken great care in sort of creating a space with LED lights and Jayhawk artwork on the wall and things like that, to, again, temporarily suspend reality to the extent that we can and study drinking in more of a natural setting. Do I think that participants really fully are immersed and forget that they're in a research lab? Probably not, and we also tell them, oh, by the way, there's cameras up in the corners and things like that. So it's still artificial in that sense. But I think we can all probably agree that if we want to study environmental cues, this is a much better setting to do that. And the advantage here is we have complete control over what is displayed in this room. Like, I can have things on the TVs if I want. I can change the bottles if I want. I can put other people in the room with you. If I study this at a bar in downtown Lawrence, I don't have control over the environment in the same way that I do in the lab. So this provides a really carefully controlled environment for doing experimental studies. I know here at Vermont, you also have smoking labs where you can do self-administration of tobacco products, so similar kinds of things. We can do self-administration of alcohol in this setting in a very safe and controlled way. So I'm going to tell you about this first study, which we just published a couple years ago. One of my former research coordinators and master's students, Emma Marsden, ran this series of studies as part of my R01 grant, where we were looking at what are the effects of alcohol cues on behavioral economic demand and craving. There was one study that McKillop had published in 2010 that showed some initial evidence for this, but it really needed to be replicated and extended. And so we had ongoing data from my R01 that was funded by NIAAA that we pulled from. And that was predominantly a neuroimaging study, but these data were collected during the in-person screening appointment. So there was no imaging involved with this. And then my colleague and former mentor, James McKillop, had data from a pharmacotherapy trial from a few years prior to that. So in the first study, we had 117 adult heavy drinkers who exceeded NIAAA weekly drinking guidelines and had at least one heavy drinking episode a week. They were 51% female, around 35 years old, median education of a bachelor's, and a median household income of 75 to 90,000 Canadian dollars in this case. McKillop's study was a slightly different type of participant, so they were all heavy drinkers as well, But these were individuals who met DSM for alcohol abuse or dependence criteria, and they were treatment seeking because they were part of a pharmacotherapy trial. So that is a slightly different set of participants. A 40% female, slightly older than ours, about the same education, about 14 years of education, so some college, but considerably lower income on average compared to our study. So this was our experimental protocol in this particular project. Both of the studies used slightly different bar labs, but the protocol was essentially the same. You bring participants into the lab, you take them first to a neutral room. You can see a picture of one here, nondescript laboratory room. You pour them their preferred, or in this case, it's just a bottle of water. We'll get to the preferred part in a second. So you pour them a bottle of water. You ask them to interact with that water, smell the drink. It's a little weird to smell water, but you'll see why we have them do that in a moment. Take a small sip of it. Notice the coolness of the glass, all of these things. And then after they're done with that, we take them into the bar lab and we essentially do the same procedure, but now it's their preferred alcoholic beverage. So whether that's a beer, a wine, or a mixed drink, in the same procedure, pick it up, take deep breaths, smell the beverage, take a small sip, notice the coolness of the glass, the color of the beverage. And then after each of those experimental manipulations, we had them do alcohol craving, so subjective reports of their craving, and we made a composite measure of 4 different questions. But we asked them, how many drinks would you consume right now at various prices? And the max price differed slightly between the 2 projects. It was either $15 or $20, but it's oriented to in the present moment, how you're feeling right now. How many drinks would you consume if they were, for example, $5 right now? And so what we found, first of all, in terms of a manipulation check, was that when participants were in the alcohol queue room so the simulated bar versus the neutral room, we saw a significant and relatively large effect size increase in craving in both of these studies. So the left is the one we ran for my RO1 in Kansas. The one on the right is that pharmacotherapy trial from 2015. So very robust impact on craving. This is more or less just a manipulation check. We're seeing increases in subjective motivation. When we look at the alcohol demand curves, it's not as pronounced of an effect, but you can see that in both the study on the left and the study on the right, the alcohol cues are stacked on top of the neutral cues. A bit larger of an effect size here on the left versus the right. But when we look at the individual demand indices, for my study in Canada, we see sort of medium to large effect size increases in intensity, breakpoint, Omax, and a 4th parameter I didn't explain called Pmax. It's essentially the price at which Omax occurs. And then similar pattern for the McKillop data from 2015 with the exception of Pmax. So if you look at it at the demand index or at the individual consumption level, you see that it's increased, but it's also increased at the level of the demand index. So this was important for us because it shows that across 2 different completely independent samples with slightly different eligibility criteria, alcohol demand robustly increases following exposure to alcohol-related cues. And so although we know quite a bit about how alcohol cues impact drinking behavior, we've been somewhat limited in understanding the actual mechanism of how that happens. Is it craving or is it something else? And so this suggests that reinforcing value might actually be a mechanism by which that happens. So in this moment, I'm placing higher value on having a drink right now, and it shows up on the alcohol purchase task. So that's part 1. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and tell you about a series of studies that look at important upcoming responsibilities and how that impacts consumption and expenditure on these demand measures or these purchase tasks. So I want to preface this by just getting you to think a moment about sort of DSM-5 substance use disorder criteria. So if you look at the specific criteria for an alcohol use disorder or an opioid use disorder, there's several of those criteria that talk about failure to maintain major life obligations or roles or responsibilities, or substance use interfering with your ability to perform well at work or in academics or causing problems with other people, right? So we all have these different roles and responsibilities that we have in our lives. And for some people, substance use can really have a negative impact on those. Their ability to be present and to be safe in those situations, and that can lead to consequences. It can lead to consequences with other people. It can lead to employment problems, financial strain, academic problems for young adults and students. And so this is kind of baked into the substance use disorder criteria that interfering with major roles and responsibilities is an important factor. There's one additional layer on those criteria that often will say continued substance use despite experiencing those consequences. So it's not just that it interferes with your relationship with your partner, it's that even though you know that, you still continue to consume the substance, and it maybe exacerbates the problem, right? So for me, it's about this idea that in certain situations or in certain circumstances, you might be less able to adjust or moderate your drinking when you know, or maybe you are unaware, but if you are aware that it's causing problems, you're less able to sort of adjust or modify your drinking in those situations. So Jim Murphy's lab at the University of Memphis did a series of studies where they looked at what they called next day responsibilities. And so essentially what they would do is they would ask convenient samples of young adult drinkers, heavy drinkers from a university sample, to do purchase tasks, a standard purchase task, just a typical evening, nothing planned tomorrow. And what if you had a class at 8 or 9 a.m. the next day? Or what if you had a test at 8 or 9 a.m. the next day, right? So it's a very plausible and important responsibility for a university student, we would hope, at least. And what you can see here in this demand figure from the Skidmore and Murphy paper is that there's a very clear attenuation or reduction in demand when they have a class, and then if they have an exam the next morning, it's even more reduced, right? So this was an important series of studies. Gilbert did a paper with Jim Murphy's group where they showed that the timing of the event matters. So is it an early morning class or is it a 12 p.m. class? And as you might not be surprised, if it's a 12 p.m. class, there was less of a reduction because it's like, well, you know, I can still manage to get up for my noon class, right? So in my lab, we became aware and sort of were thinking about this, that there's important information you can glean from that, but it only captures sort of a segment of the population of people who consume alcohol. And so we're kind of missing the broader sort of sample of community adults who are not students. And we're also predominantly focusing on academic responsibilities. So when my current PhD student, Brandon Miller, joined my lab for his first year project, I kind of shepherded him along this idea of we should replicate Skidmore and Murphy and Gilbert, but we should do this with community adult drinkers to the extent we can get them, and we should do this with a broader range of responsibilities. So this was right in the middle of COVID. So when we say community adult drinkers, like many people, we turn to crowdsourcing to do that. So are they really community adult drinkers? We can sort of have a conversation about that. But nonetheless, what we did in this study was we recruited 261. We actually recruited more from MTurk, but if anybody's done work on MTurk, you often have to filter it down with sort of bot responses and attention checks and things. So 261 was our final sample. And I want to show you a few things to illustrate the unique aspects of this sample relative to the Skidmore and Gilbert and Murphy studies. So 92% of our sample was full-time or part-time employed, 88% non-student, 50% of them had children or dependents, and 24% were responsible for providing care to another person, family member. Those last two will be important in just a moment. So I think we did a pretty good job of capturing a non-student sample here to extend the work that Skidmore and Murphy and Gilbert did. So what we did in this study was we had people rank order 8 possible roles or responsibilities. And so they took this list of 8, so it's things like going to work. We tried to get that class versus exam sort of nuance with, you have work in the morning, but you have a meeting or a training or some other important activity. So it's not just going to work and sitting at your desk, you have something important. Having a job interview is kind of really high stakes. For some of our participants, they had kids or family members that they were responsible to provide care for, so we asked about that. Then we wanted to broaden it out. So we had sort of some civic minded things like community volunteer activity, and then just some hobbies like going to a fitness class that you paid for or going to a gym with another person. And so we did alcohol purchase tasks in the context of those responsibilities for their top 2 ranked activities. So imagine that you have this happening in the morning tomorrow versus you don't have anything, no work, no class, no activity, right? And so the first thing we found, which was perhaps not surprising, is when you look at the 3 purchase tasks for the no responsibility and unfilled squares, and then the 2 individually, personally ranked number 1 and number 2, it didn't matter whether it was your top responsibility or your second responsibility. They both equally suppressed demand. So what that allowed us to do is then collapse. So we didn't really care if it was your first or your second. We looked at everybody that chose work or everybody that chose caring for kids. And so what this is showing you are demand curves for those individual types of responsibilities. And the sample sizes are different because remember, this is based on how they ranked what their most important things were. And so you can see that across essentially all of these, when they have that responsibility upcoming in the next morning, demand is suppressed relative to when it's not happening. And that was encouraging to see, perhaps wasn't surprising, but again, we were one of the first to show this experimentally. For the other 3 categories, one of the things you'll notice that the endorsement of those were not very common. So I guess it wasn't a very civically minded group on MTurk. Only 12 people said volunteering was the most important to them. So the error bars are really high here, but the general pattern is the same. Just wasn't as robust. And then if you look, Steve and I spent some time this morning talking about intensity of demand. So that's what we've pulled out here. This is consumption at free price. And what really strikes me here is like one of the highest stakes things here, a job interview the next morning had the greatest reduction in intensity of demand relative to the others in terms of the percent reduction. Whereas some of these other things like volunteering or going to the gym with friends, it reduced a little bit, but only about 25 to 20%. So this was an important study because it took the findings in young adults and replicated and extended it to a broader demographic of community adults who were employed and not currently in school, and with a broader range of personally relevant responsibilities. But to this point, all of the research had been done with just one substance, so with alcohol demand. So my team just recently published a paper where we tried to extend this to cannabis use. So one of the things I'm very proud about with this paper, and I specifically put everybody up here, is, and I'll show you specific pictures in a moment, but this was an all hands on deck paper. So even the undergrads in my lab were involved with every aspect of this, and they were rewarded for their efforts to be co-authors on this paper. So it was really, I've been wanting to do that for a while in my lab, to have an opportunity for everybody to contribute to a paper and do so in a meaningful way so that everybody has earned publication. So we switched from MTurk to another crowdsourcing platform known as Prolific, but we recruited 177 cannabis consumers, close to 50% men and women, and around 36 and a half, 37 years old. And in this case, we used what's called the marijuana purchase task, same basic premise, consumption of marijuana at escalating prices. But in this case, we had them do a marijuana purchase task where they had nothing specific planned the next morning, and then other versions where they had 5 specific responsibilities. And so what's interesting here is that in this sample of participants, only a subset of them reported to us that they had kids or cared for another person. So that's why those sample sizes are smaller. But for the most part, demand was decreased when they had something happening the next morning. This is demand for cannabis in a no responsibility and a responsibility condition. But what's interesting is you can clearly see that certain conditions have a much larger effect size. So like the interview, for example, or caring for kids or caring for others, the effect size tended to be larger in terms of the reduction relative to just, I have an exercise planned in the morning, or I just have to go to work at my job, but there's nothing specific, sort of high stakes happening. So this led us to think about, are there individual differences here? So, right, so these are aggregate demand curves. These are averages across the 177 or whatever the sample size is. And so my postdoc at the time, and she's now at Rutgers as a faculty member, Sarah Weinstock, had done some work looking at the compatibility of alcohol use with different activities. And so she came up with this question: how suitable is substance use with this activity? In this case, cannabis. Her work was on alcohol. So we asked a similar question: how suitable is cannabis use with each of those activities that we assessed? And they rated it just on a 4-point scale. And then if you just do the percentages of people that endorse those different levels, you find something kind of interesting, right? So in this case, red, or the more red it gets, it's the more unsuitable the participants thought it was with that activity. So things like an interview or caring for your kids, 40 to 47% of participants said it was either somewhat unsuitable or completely unsuitable. Whereas for something like work, we only have about 25% of people are saying somewhat, and even fewer are saying completely unsuitable, whereas the green bars are quite a bit more. And then exercise, which had the smallest effect size on the previous demand curves, overwhelmingly only 17% of people said it was even somewhat unsuitable, right? So then what happens if you take those demand curves and you split them based on how people responded here? So to do this, we just simplified and took the 2 green bars and averaged, and took the 2 red and pink bars and formed 2 groups. And essentially what we see, it's a little small, but on the left are the people that are saying it's completely or somewhat unsuitable with that activity. And on the right, it's people that are in the green. It's either somewhat or completely unsuitable. And so again, this is maybe not surprising, but we had needed to demonstrate it empirically, that if you're saying it's somewhat or completely suitable, you're not really reducing your cannabis use, at least at the average level, that much. There's some of a reduction. Some of that could be demand characteristics, people saying sort of social desirability bias here. They're saying it because they know that. But if you're saying it's completely or somewhat unsuitable, your demand essentially in many of these situations tanks down to almost zero or very flat, particularly if you've got a job interview or if you've got to take care of your kids. So think about those initial demand curves I showed you, which were at the aggregate level. We missed some of this nuance there. And it's so often in behavioral economics, we look at mean or median demand curves. What I think this data suggests is that there's often a lot more really interesting individual variability there that we don't often capture. So then I'm just going to kind of orient you to a moment to another piece of this study, which we found really clever. And that is some qualitative work that we did in collaboration with Elizabeth Aston at Brown, where she's done a variety of studies looking at using mixed methods to sort of refine purchase tasks. So she told us, well, why don't you just include some open-ended questions to ask people why or why not are they consuming in these different situations? And then we got their raw responses, and there was, some garbage in there because it's crowdsourcing, but we actually had really good responses from quite a few of the participants. Then we did a thematic analysis using a legitimate quantitative or qualitative approach. And I put Anna Lester and Christina Chen up here because they were the 2 undergrads that really led the charge on this for one of their independent projects. And both of them got to be co-authors on this paper because of it. So a thematic analysis essentially is looking at open-ended text responses and trying to sort of bring out sort of superordinate level themes that participants are telling you. And then you look for specific examples that are representative of that. So what you can see on the left essentially were the themes that we identified from the responses and the percentage of participants that endorsed that theme for a given situation. So overwhelmingly, what we found was that people said that cannabis didn't really matter if I used cannabis because I wouldn't feel it the next morning, right? So I might in the moment feel high or impaired, but by the time I wake up the next morning, there's going to be no lingering effects. That's very different from a heavy drinking episode when it comes to alcohol, right? You're going to feel hungover or going to have some of those sort of negative impacts. And interestingly, one of the things you're going to see on here is a little bit farther down to the bottom. It's about midway down. It says better than alcohol. So some participants even told us that cannabis isn't like alcohol. It's not going to affect me the next day. But also some participants actually reported that they would not suppress their use if they had a job interview or if they had something stressful coming up because it helps them to relax or to calm their nerves or might help them sleep better, right? We had some people that said that it might lead to some cognitive impairment. So if I have work or if I have something else important, I don't want to do that. So over here to the right, though, you can see that what we've done here is we've also broken it down based on those suitability ratings. And this is just one example of work in this case. And if you're really interested in this, you can pull the paper. We have all these tables in the supplement. You can see how it breaks down. But for example, participants who were more likely to say that it was for relaxation, improving their mood or sleep, were more likely to also endorse it was being suitable completely or somewhat suitable. Whereas if it was somebody who said that there would be negative social consequences or there would be executive function impairment, they were more likely to say it was suitable or completely unsuitable or somewhat unsuitable. So again, this nuance is often missed when we look at the aggregate level. And so what this tells us is that for a substance like cannabis, next morning may not be the ideal time frame to assess the impact of responsibilities. And without the qualitative data, we really wouldn't have known that that's sort of how participants were sort of reasoning when they made these choices. So in this particular study, we showed that a series of studies, a range of responsibilities decrease alcohol and cannabis demand, and that it seems that work-related and caregiving activities are some of the strongest impacts. But there are important individual differences, and I would encourage you in your work to find ways. I mean, I've been converted to the value of qualitative data through this series of studies. It can be as simple as including some open-ended questions in your surveys, and then you just need to partner with people that know how to analyze that data properly. There are rigorous methods for doing thematic analysis or other types of text-based analysis. But I think this is a paper that I'm really proud of because, again, these were things that normally get missed. So I'm going to close with a couple of studies here in the third part, looking at a particular type of a high-risk behavior, which is cannabis or alcohol-impaired driving. And I started this work in my postdoc, and we've sort of extended it into when I was a faculty member in Canada. Right around the time when I started that position, they legalized cannabis at the federal level in Canada, so there was a lot of interest in harm reduction for impaired driving. There was a lot of focus on this, so we wrote a couple of papers on that. And I've just always sort of been interested in impaired driving as a particularly high risk, high consequence behavior, but it's also a behavior where people don't often encounter those consequences. Like the consequences can be severe, but they're relatively rare. And so it's an interesting behavior to study from the standpoint of whether or not people would continue to consume in those situations. So my work and others has argued that elevated demand is more of a distal risk factor for this. So I don't believe that just because somebody has high level of demand, that immediately is going to lead to them deciding whether or not to consume alcohol or not. The closest things for that are like level of subjective intoxication, social norms, prior experience, things like that. But behavioral economic demand is part of the equation, I would argue. It's a bit distal, right? But just to illustrate this, once again, this is Harry Patel from my lab. You saw one of these already, but I'm showing you the cannabis version on the bottom here. People that engage in this behavior on a somewhat regular basis, either monthly or greater, driving after alcohol or driving after cannabis use, are reporting higher demand relative to people that do not engage in that behavior at the trait level. Teeters and Murphy, again from Jim Murphy's lab in 2015, did a really clever study where they took the purchase task and they said, okay, in this particular situation, it's a typical drinking scenario where there's no explicit driving requirement, just a typical night. They don't explicitly say you're not driving, it's just a typical evening. And then they have another one where they explicitly say, in an hour, you're going to be driving a vehicle after you're done drinking. And then they say, how many drinks would you consume? So it's not a particularly huge effect, but it does decrease by about 3 drinks or so at intensity, and then it is lower across the other prices when they're in that driving scenario versus when they're not. So my current PhD student, Brandon Miller, did his master's thesis where there was sort of this really elegant laboratory study within subjects' manipulations of cues and sleep context and driving context. So today I'm only going to tell you about the driving part. but it's published in Drug and Alcohol Dependence if you want to read that paper, where this was an in-person laboratory session with 79 weekly or greater cannabis consumers around 24 years old, and relatively high. So QDIT R of 15.6 is a relatively high score, indicating a very likely cannabis use disorder for many of the participants in the sample. So similar to the Teeters paper, he had participants do purchase tasks where they imagined that they were going to be driving in 30 minutes. Okay. And so what he found was a really sizable effect size. Okay. So if you tell participants that you have to drive a vehicle in 30 minutes, they suppress how much they're going to consume across most of the prices relative to just a typical situation right now when they're not having to drive. But it's notable that even in the driving scenario, so this is a state-based MPT, which uses hits. There's a number of hits, and it's estimated that a hit or that a joint has about 10 hits. It's kind of the running ballpark that we use for these sorts of studies. And Liz Aston's group at Brown has shown that that's the case. So even if they know they have to drive in 30 minutes, they're still taking about half of a joint, these participants on average. Now, that could be attributed to the fact that they had elevated QDIT scores, the relatively heavy cannabis consuming group of participants. But I think that's notable that even at 30 minutes, it's suppressed, but it's certainly not suppressed completely. So then this led us to ask the question of, is the actual timing of the driving important? So this was informed by a series of studies that we read about in this report. Around the time when cannabis legalization was really starting to expand, it's continuing to expand, obviously. There was this expert panel that came together, and their task was to try and inform state policymakers and legislatures about how are we going to enforce cannabis impaired driving. And so it's a really great report if you're interested in that, but I want to pull out one part in particular. They break it down like this. When you're smoking cannabis, there's an acute phase where your impairment in driving skills is most pronounced from when you're smoking to 60 minutes later. Okay. And then there is this post-acute phase and this residual phase lasting from an hour up to sort of 2.5 hours and beyond, where impairment rapidly subsides. Okay. And it does differ based on dose and a few things, but the typical 20 milligram THC dose lasts for about 2 to 3 hours in this residual phase, where you still have some impairment, but the really pronounced impairment happens at about between smoking and 60 minutes. Well, it's not surprising when we look at subjective intoxication, subjective high. For smoked cannabis, it tends to peak at about 20 minutes, and it will rapidly subside after that. And then if you look at impairment in driving performance, so there's quite a bit on this figure. I want you to look at the white bars here. That's an objective measure of driving performance, and you can see that the impairment peaks around 20 to 40 minutes post-smoking, and then it decreases pretty precipitously from 40 to 150 minutes. Not quite sure what's happening out at more than 150 minutes, but it's certainly likely not cannabis involved at that point. But the peak is around 20 to 40 minutes, okay? So we ran a study with 167 cannabis consumers recruited from crowdsourcing on Prolific. And we used the same type of an approach where we looked at a marijuana purchase task for different situations, but we manipulated the latency to driving and we counterbalanced the order across participants. So you have to drive in 20 minutes. You have to drive in an hour. You have to drive in 6 hours. So we're kind of in that acute phase, right at the boundary of that sort of post-acute phase, and then in that residual phase, right? And so those were presented in random order. And what's interesting is, perhaps not surprisingly, the level of demand scaled with the duration of the latency of driving. So if you don't have to drink, or if you don't have to drive, you're consuming on average about 25 hits. But if you have to drive in 20 minutes, that essentially goes down to nearly zero, but it's still around half of a joint at this point. 1 hour was still pretty low, but by the time you get to 6 hours, you're starting to rebound up to sort of unrestricted no driving limits. If we break the sample up based on whether or not they have a history of engaging in driving after cannabis use, just by self-report. So have you done this before? So it's kind of a rough kind of coarse measure of that. What's interesting is that the groups didn't differ in the non-driving condition. So it doesn't matter if you have a history of driving after cannabis use or not. When it's a non-driving situation, there was no differentiation between the groups, which is, I think, encouraging to see. We wouldn't expect there to be a difference. But as soon as we introduce a driving requirement, both groups suppress and they stay and they kind of have this rebound that happens. But look at the difference between the never driving after cannabis use and the driving after cannabis use group. They both suppress, but the driving after cannabis use suppress less so. What the operation of that, why that's happening, we haven't unpacked that yet. It could be that these are people that do this a lot. They don't see that it impairs their driving. There's actually sort of anecdotally, people will say, well, I'm actually a more careful driver after I smoke pot because I'm more attentive and I'm more engaged. So in that sense, maybe that's part of what's operating here in the people that have a history of doing this. Dating all the way back to my postdoc, my mentor in postdoc was interested in sort of driving related perceptions, risk perceptions. So we would ask people, how dangerous do you think it is to do this? So we asked participants straight up, how dangerous is it, do you think it is to drive within 20 minutes or 60 minutes or 6 hours? And then if you break it up by that, see, these are the same demand curves, but this is only for 20 minutes. And this has now been based on their level of danger. So look at the group that is not at all dangerous. That's essentially no reduction at all in their demand. Whereas the little dangerous is down to that kind of half a joint. And then you've got your two red and pinks, you're somewhat dangerous and you're very dangerous, essentially zero across every point. So why am I showing you this? The reason I'm showing you this is because I think that green group is ripe for an intervention, right? We need to understand that group that is saying it's not at all dangerous, and I'm going to consume essentially the same amount I would as if I didn't have any driving obligations. And are they doing that very frequently? And what would it take for them to shift their consumption down to some of these other levels, right? So again, shows context matters, individual differences matter when we think about these things. And something as simple as just asking their perceptions of the dangerousness of a behavior allows us to tease apart meaningful subgroups within our sample. So I want to close with just telling you about 4 very sort of preview things of what we're doing in my lab. So everything I've told you about cannabis so far has been smoked cannabis. But we know that that is obviously not the only type of cannabis that people are consuming. Oral or edible products are increasingly growing in the market in terms of their market share, but we do not have very good measures of cannabis demand for oral cannabis or edibles. So I'm partnering with Elizabeth Aston at Brown University to do some mixed methods research right now to try and sort of refine measures for oral cannabis, so edibles specifically, gummies, candies, things like that. So stay tuned for that. We're really excited about it. Much of the work I've shown you has either been in the lab or on crowdsourcing, but if we really want to understand how behavior operates in context, we should look at how behavior operates in people's real world in their daily lives. So we're starting to move outside the lab to do daily diary studies or ecological momentary assessment studies. With my former postdoc and my current graduate students are doing this work. So there's a limited number of studies in behavioral economics on this, but we're really starting to move that forward. Substance-free alternative activities, so engaging in behaviors that can serve as substitutes for alcohol. And then I didn't have any time to talk about it today, but my lab has a whole other line of research doing brain imaging to look at how the brain supports these types of decisions. And there'll be more to come from that in the coming years. So hopefully I've convinced you, if you weren't already on board, that behavioral economics is an important process to study addiction. It provides some really valid and efficient ways to assess reinforcing value. Hopefully I've also convinced you that context matters, whether that's environmental cues, whether that is the presence of work responsibilities or caregiving responsibilities, and also whether or not you have important obligations like having to drive a vehicle coming up. That all matters, and it all changes how people respond on these tasks in the moment. I want to just end with thanking the many, many people that have made a lot of this work possible. including generous funding from federal agencies as well as university and other sources. And with that, I welcome your questions and thanks for your attention.
Thanks for a great talk, Michael. So we have time maybe for one question from the in-person audience and one from the online audience. So is there a question?
Thank you for a great talk. I know that you said that you'd focus on the demand, but do you have delayed discounting data that you can correlate with risky behavior?
Yeah, so we do. We have usually at baseline, we do the full suite of behavioral economic measures. So we're doing demand, discounting, proportionate alcohol reinforcement, to really try and capture this notion of reinforcer pathology. There's kind of two sides to that model. In our work, we often don't find that empirically reinforcer pathology plays out in the ways you might expect. Like it makes conceptual sense when Bickle and colleagues developed this model, but we often find that just because somebody is a steep discounter doesn't mean that they're also having elevated demand in the way that you would expect based on that sort of quadrant model. But yeah, we have discounting data as part of baseline. We're not getting it in any of the daily diet or EMA approaches, although we could. But yeah, it's something that we definitely could look at.
Expect separation, especially in the perceptions of risk.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. So Steve and I were talking a little bit about some of the alternatives to driving your own vehicle often are inherently delayed, waiting for an Uber, waiting for a friend to pick you up. On college campuses, they have these safe ride programs where a van will come pick you up and take you back to your dorm or to your apartment. Those often are plagued by having significant wait times. So then it becomes kind of a delay discounting problem on top of a risk perception, or sort of how are you evaluating the relative potential for consequences. So it definitely plays a part. It's a great point.
We have a couple of questions online, but I'll just ask one here. This is from Marcelo Enriquez from the Virginia Tech at Roanoke, and he's interested in virtual reality and whether you know of any research that's been done on that, especially when it comes to Q induction bar studies.
Yeah, so there have been a number of studies that have looked at Q exposure versus delivered via VR. We had a VR system when I was in graduate school, but this was back in 2007, 2009, when VR technology was not very good. And I can tell you that putting on those head-mounted displays, it was, in my opinion, it was almost worse than not having cues at all, because it just felt very artificial. It was not immersive. But with the, massive improvements in VR technology and how immersive it could be, I certainly imagine you could do that using VR equipment if you don't have a bar lab. I think one of the things that makes it challenging is with these cue exposures, they're multimodal in terms of we're getting visual cues. There's usually auditory cues of the script they're listening to. There's tactile cues of holding the beverage. We will have them pick the drink up and take deep breaths of the smell of the beverage, sometimes take a small sip. So it's kind of weird if you're holding, the VR handsets and you got the head-mounted display on. I think you could do it if providing the drink in the moment was not a possibility, then it would work. But I think that some of the real power of a cue exposure is really having the beverage right in front of you and being able to smell it. And so, if there'd be ways to combine the two so you could still have that immersive element of the actual beverage, then I'm sure it could work. But I'm not as clear on whether people are really leveraging it for cue exposures that much. There's many ways you can do it. In an imaging setting, you can just present people with pictures or small video clips of drinking or of alcoholic beverages, which is still not as good as a bar lab, right? So cue reactivity sort of exists on a continuum, and you pick the method that best fits what your research question is, or the constraints of what you're trying to accomplish. I can't take a bar and put it into an MRI scanner, right? But maybe I could have somebody do an immersive, maybe not a perfectly head-mounted display, but some sort of a very immersive video when they're inside the scanner. That might be a really interesting approach. It's a great question.
All right. Well, I think we are out of time, unfortunately, but thanks again, Michael, for an excellent lecture, and thanks to the in-person and online audiences for being with us. And that wraps it up for today.